Believe it or not, I'm actually a bit nervous to talk about this trilogy. Now, that's not just because hardcore fans of both films and comics can sometimes look for any and all excuses to shit on another person's opinions about what they consider to be their favorite stories, but also because it was quite impactful to me personally growing up. The trilogy came out in my late middle school, early high school years, and the lessons they taught of dignity, respect, love, and teamwork honestly helped me navigate a lot of social and personal situations that I faced. Now, I'm sure we all know of at least one person who would complain about politics in superhero films, but the rest of us clearly know that that's all they've ever really been about, even back in the comics. Now, there is something I want to make abundantly clear right from the offset before I get any sort of comments, because I haven't even made a point yet. I know the thumbnail says why X2 is the best, and it is. But that's not to say that I think the first or the third film are bad. Quite the opposite. I enjoy them all. And in fact, I'm going to be speaking about all three. But it's in the context of why I believe X2 was the best of the trilogy. Now, if you follow this channel for any real length of time, you'll know that half of the things that I cover don't particularly do well in terms of box office. Now, obviously, this trilogy lands on the greener side of that fence, but I think looking at the budget and returns of each of the installments really will help to prove my overall point. X1, which came out in 2000 and was made for about $75 million, ended up making nearly $300 million. X2 dropped in 2003 and cost about $125 million and ended up banking over $400 million. And then X3 came out in 2006, cost about $200 million, made about $450 million. So all clearly decent budgets, all good returns, but we can clearly see which one had the biggest earnings. Now, to get to the core of my point, for those of you who may not want to sit and listen to my thought in its entirety, I'll simply say this. X2 had the best conflict and character growth of the entire trilogy. If that's all you're after, there you go. Feel free to go and watch something else. But if you're curious to hear my reasoning, go ahead and get comfy. First, let's talk about why I love both X1 and X3. X1 does a remarkable job at setting up everything we need to know right within the first few minutes. From the non-initiated standpoint, you get a firm grasp of the level of fear and paranoia of humans about the growing mutant population. We meet our point of view characters in Rogue and Wolverine, and we get a brief but insightful dialogue of the two spiritual leaders of this mutant conflict. Not to mention, the opening concentration camp scene was really incredible, and it helps you immediately understand why Magneto would see things the way he does. He already survived a genocide of his people once, and now he's trying to prevent it from happening again. I mean, the film at its core is about the fear of the future and how each side chooses to handle it. From one perspective, we have Magneto and the Brotherhood. Magneto's fear of events of the past repeating has led him down a very militant path, and he's been preparing for all-out war. On another perspective, we have the governments of the world fearful of what mutants could unleash upon the established order. Now, we really only get a point of view from Senator Kelly on that front, but he certainly speaks as a microcosm of the general fear and paranoia that's going on within the community. And yes, I know the opening Senate hearing scene was mimicking the Red Scare stuff. It's already been talked about. Calm down. Charles, and by extension the X-Men, represent the middle ground of that fear. They do fear what will happen if diplomacy is not attempted with full vigor and sincerity, but they do also fear what will happen if diplomacy fails and their own kind try to strike first. X3 had a number of things going for it as well. From the inclusion of Beast and getting a lot of his insight and the personal/professional struggle he was going through, to the younger members of the team like Shadowcat, Iceman, and Colossus getting more screen time and responsibility, to to even things like the danger room scene, and yes, I know the fastball special's there, everybody settle down. The mutant cure conversation, which we not only get multiple angles of that discussion, but it also feels like it's a spiritual blueprint to what would eventually be seen with the Sokovia Core discussions in the later MCU. Not to mention, the flashback scene where Charles first meets Jean also feels like a spiritual framework to what the Harry Potter series would use a few years later when Dumbledore first meets Tom Riddle.
We are like you.
Really? I doubt that.
Well, I'm like you, Tom. I'm different.
Prove it.
And if X1 was about the fear of the future and how each side chose to handle it, then X3 is very much about dealing with the consequences of acting on our fears. From the mutant side of things, they're dealing with the consequences of not only their previous fights amongst each other, but the consequences of how the public perceives them based on how situations were manipulated and spun, both by other humans like Kelly and Stryker, but also unfortunately the very byproduct of what Magneto's been up to. Now, I know that when it comes to the topic of what people consider to be the most impactful scenes from the first film and the third film, I'm sure many of you will have your own answers, and I do encourage you to put them in the comments because it would be great to talk with you about them. But for me personally, Storm actually comes to mind for both of those choices. In the first film, she has a brief conversation with Senator Kelly after he gets forcibly mutated and goes to them for help. It's pretty quick, but the exchange really helps them see eye to eye for a moment and helps Storm get a new level of understanding of the greater situation.
Do you hate normal people?
Sometimes.
Why?
I'm afraid of them.
I think you've got one less person to be afraid of.
She's lived almost all of her life with her powers and has spent all of her adult life here with the team, who obviously love, respect, and accept her. But she's had this festering fear and hatred of humans because of what she's been seeing over the years, and she ends up forgetting that that feeling sort of works both ways, and it's a simple matter of putting yourself in the other's shoes. In the third film, after the death of Charles, there's a moment of uncertainty about the future of the school and the students. Beast thinks it's just best to close the school, but Storm realizes that Charles' vision and hope for the future is something that cannot be lost, even while trying to navigate the greater consequences of this situation. She remains steadfast and determined to keep the school open and to keep that hope alive, despite what's happening.
Sorry, I know this is a bad time. I was told that this was a safe place for mutants.
It was, son.
And it still is. We'll find you a room. Hank, tell all the students the school stays open.
Now, as I said, I really do enjoy all three of these films. I think it's a really fun trilogy. But if we're being honest, and I'm laying my cards on the table, 1 and 3 have probably as many misses as they do hits. So let's take a moment and talk about that. Take X1. Though it is a great setup to the story and some of the characters, many other characters felt underused and just plain bland. Storm didn't get a lot to do, for example, outside of her conversation with Kelly. Despite how powerful she really is, she really didn't do much past make it foggy and shoot like 2 bolts of lightning. Scott just felt like a plank of wood, and that's despite James Marsden being a terrific actor. Mystique did like one cool thing towards the start of the film, and then she just gets bodied by Wolverine at the end. And outside of standing around and looking cute, Jean did fuck all. I mean, she's seriously one of the most powerful characters out there, and she did fuck all. You could have put Beast in her place, and at least all of the lab stuff would have been more interesting to watch and listen to. Now, again, I like X3, but with X3, there's also a lot of glaring issues that you're being asked to shrug off. Now, the most baffling one being the fact that Charles is kind of a dick in this film. He goes from being kind and understanding in the last 2 films to this bitter and bossy guy who feels offended that anyone dares question his decisions.
I don't have to explain myself. Least of all to you. I came to bring Jean home. Don't interfere, Eric.
I mean, had he been a bit nicer, I might have felt sadder for him getting turned into a new coat of living room paint. And then there are some things like the costumes. And by costumes, I specifically mean the fact that Juggernaut and the new set of mutants that followed Magneto look absolutely fucking ridiculous. Also, speaking of Magneto's people, somehow Magneto has a whole camp of mutants who want to go to war, but when Logan shows up looking for Jean, he's attacked by one guy with powers and everyone else just has guns. Like, that's gonna do anything to any of the X-Men who would possibly show up, let alone Wolverine specifically. Magneto even admits that he knew Logan was coming, so why didn't he bother sending anyone more significant? I really don't understand it. There is also the fact that Angel was 100% useless in this film. He shows up in like 4 scenes, he says 5 lines of dialogue maybe, and then he just shows up during the last battle to save his dad, who, let's all be honest, his dad deserved to die. So it's kind of ridiculous that he got saved. And I mean, what's worse, Angel doesn't even stick around to help fight the battle. He just saves his dad and pieces out. And lastly, the battle at Jean's house just kind of baffles me all around. Somehow Wolverine doesn't manage to stab Juggernaut even once. Storm does this goofy ass Street Fighter level spin attack. And then just gets immediately bodied by the speedster. And despite the fact that Jean is using her power to lift everyone and pin them to the ceiling, somehow Eric is just sitting on the floor in the kitchen with no kind of indication that he's using his powers. Again, the whole scene just kind of makes me scratch my head more than anything. So again, 1 and 3 are enjoyable. I really like watching them. But even I can admit, at times they do get a little shaky. So all this is in service to me finally answering the question, why do I think X2 takes the gold? Well, let's go ahead and break that down finally. If X1 was about the fear of the future and how each side chose to handle it, and X3 was about dealing with the consequences of acting on their fears, then X2 slots perfectly in the middle, which would be making the first real move to act on your fears. Hence why this movie starts with an assassination attempt. The events of the first film kicked off all sides making larger moves. So Stryker takes advantage of the fear and paranoia generated from those events and makes sure that he has everything he needs to get the power and resources that he wants to achieve his goal. And what's genius about his move is that it ultimately didn't matter whether or not Nightcrawler succeeded. In fact, it was probably better for Stryker if the assassination failed. Because as we see, he walks right into the White House and takes advantage of a panicked president who was almost killed and will agree to anything Stryker wants.
What do you need, William?
Just your authorization for a special operation.
The X-Men spend most of the film reacting to both Stryker's moves and Magneto's plans, but when they finally make their own first move, it ends up being visiting the president to speak with him. And I believe it perfectly sets up the stage for what's to come. Because despite Charles' intentions, their visit comes off as just as much of a threat as it does a peace offering. Sure, they give the president some of Stryker's files to prove that they're telling the truth, but they end up just kind of spooking the guy out. I mean, they show up in the dark after freezing everybody, they tell the president that they aren't going anywhere, and then they go on to say,
"We're here to stay, Mr. President. The next move is yours."
We'll be watching.
So by the time the third film comes, things are at a fever pitch. Sure, there is a Secretary of Mutant Affairs indicating a level of acceptance of the mutant population, but the president is still on a hair trigger when it comes to responding to mutant threats. Even though Magneto spends half the time in prison, by the end he's already made his larger moves in ensuring Stryker's death, making sure the base and its research is destroyed, and that he's gearing up to expand his numbers for what comes next. So not only is X2 the best in terms of its core messaging, it also has some of the best character growth and use of powers in the whole trilogy. On one side of the coin is the growth and insight of the characters, like Storm talking to Nightcrawler about their emotions.
You know, outside of the circus, most people were afraid of me, but I didn't hate them. I pitied them. Do you know why? Because most people will never know anything beyond what they see with their own two eyes.
Mystique having one of the most impactful things that not only she has said, but has been said throughout any of the X-Men films.
They say you can imitate anybody, even their voice. Then why not stay in disguise all the time? Look like everyone else.
Because we shouldn't have to.
Magneto's manipulating conversation with Pyro.
You are a god among insects. Never let anyone tell you different.
And Logan becoming a guardian figure after being mostly selfish in the first film.
Who has the answers, Wolverine? Those people? That creature in your arms?
I'll take my chances with him.
I mean, Logan even tries to bring a level of comfort and understanding to Scott, a guy he actively hates, when they're both grieving.
Listen, she did make a choice. It was you.
On the other side of that coin is, like I mentioned, the best display of powers we've seen in the trilogy. Magneto's awe-inspiring and brutal prison escape scene is arguably more terrifying and a greater sense of power than anything we see in the third film. Now, in X3, the best Magneto does is move the Golden Gate Bridge, which I'm not saying isn't impressive, but since he's one of the most powerful mutants on the planet, it seems pretty easy that he could do something like that. But in X2, he literally kills a guy by ripping out the iron from his bloodstream and uses that iron to create balls to shoot rapidly, breaking his cage, killing his guards, and even turning one of those balls into a platform for him to ride on. I mean, it's one of the coolest prison escapes and things we've seen, not just in the X-Men, not just in the MCU, but films, period. Then there's a moment Jean's starting to fully touch her Phoenix powers when she's holding back the water while lifting the jet. Arguably, that's more impressive than what we got in X3. I mean, X3 is pretty much Phoenix just disintegrating people and things, which, admittedly, with what you could do with someone who has limitless powers, that seems really boring. But this is just regular Jean pushing herself to her absolute limits and not only making an important sacrifice, but being an example to the younger students who would go on to continue to fight in the team. The incredible assassination attempt that shows how powerful and dangerous Nightcrawler can be is obviously one of the go-to examples. But also, there's Storm. Storm goes from just making fog and shooting a few bolts of lightning in the first and third film to her summoning a multi-tornado storm in an instant to fight off military planes. Then there's Rogue taking Pyro's powers to simultaneously stop him from hurting anyone else, but also to put out the fires that he set. And there's multiple examples we get for Charles' powers. Now, the easier one is we have two different instances of him freezing large groups of people in a public space so that him and his team can act freely and then leave the area unnoticed. But what's more impressive and honestly terrifying is the fact that Charles was turned into a WMD when he was mentally controlled. First he had to attack mutants, and then he was made to attack humans instead. But in the span of maybe 5 minutes, the entire population of Earth had been attacked and affected. We wouldn't see something of that magnitude until Infinity War and Endgame. And lastly, in an honorable mention, we have to circle back to Rogue. Because even though it's not a power per se, she was the one who said, fuck it, I can't go in the base and help my team, but I can sure as hell, possibly, maybe, hopefully, get the jet to them so we can all escape. She was scared shitless, but she pulled it off, and she's the MVP for that. So, there it is. My overall thoughts on the trilogy. For all its hits and its misses, it's a pretty solid watch, and I always enjoy it. And speaking of enjoyable and fun things, there are some pretty humorous things that happen throughout the trilogy, so I do actually want to go ahead and end on that. X1 has a quick frame of the guy cleaning up the ring, sweeping hair, which is making the joke that Logan is an animal and he sheds, which is fucking hilarious. Then there's Magneto calling Scott a dumbass for his suggestion at the Statue of Liberty.
Storm, fry him.
Oh yes, a bolt of lightning into a huge copper conductor. I thought you lived at a school.
Then there's the fun bit that the kid at school who can teleport, and he should be able to absolutely body anybody he plays in basketball. And I'm sure there's some joke I could make about Jean coming back like Gandalf. Also, it's personally hilarious to me that somebody decided to take X3 seriously, but then decided to add a bowling ball sound effect to Juggernaut knocking over people. And lastly, both finishing off the funny bits as well as proving why X2 was the best, because Mystique was trying to get some dick.